to welcome everyone to our donor webcast on the topic, What Does Conservatism Have to Say About the Global Pandemic? I'm Charlie Copeland, the president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and it is a privilege to welcome you to what promises to be a thoughtful and wide-ranging conversation. If you're joining us tonight, it is because you have been a loyal supporter of ISI. Thank you for your faith in our mission to teach students the American tradition of liberty. With our faculty network and our student societies, ISI has a presence on 40% of America's college campuses, a larger reach than any other campus-based conservative educational organization. And your generosity has allowed us to build the outreach and the programs that have produced principal leaders in business, law, academia, journalism, government, and many other areas of American life. For that, I am truly grateful to you, and I'm excited to offer this invitation-only program tonight as a way for you to engage with us in the battle of ideas. Tonight, we're fortunate to have with us three panelists who have been writing and thinking about the long-term impact of the current crisis. They're all highly regarded writers and thinkers. They're also friends of ISI. Our first panelist is Heather McDonald. David Brooks may have said it best about Heather, quote, "If there were any justice in the world, she would be knee-deep in Pulitzer Prizes and National Magazine Awards for her pioneering work." Heather does a lot of that work for City Journal, where she is a contributing editor. But you may also be familiar with her New York Times best-selling books, including The Diversity Delusion and The War on Cops. Last November, you might have seen Heather on Fox News or read her in the Wall Street Journal, as ISI's had invited her to speak at Holy Cross. But in the sign of the times, the campus left had denied her an audience there. So Heather has been looking at the global response to COVID-19. I'm excited to hear what she has uncovered. Our next speaker will be Richard Reinsch. Richard was an ISI honor scholar when he was an undergraduate. He also writes for ISI's Modern Age, among many other publications. And ISI published his first book on Whittaker Chambers. But you may know Richard best from his work as editor of Liberty Fund's excellent online journal, Law and Liberty, where he also hosts the podcast Liberty Law Talk. Richard recently published a thoughtful piece on COVID-19 called Come Home, America, We're at War. I'm looking forward to hearing him talk about that. And the final panelist is Wilfred M. McClay. Bill is one of today's leading historians. In fact, his most recent book, Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story, received ISI's 2020 Conservative Book of the Year award. I highly recommend it. Bill holds the Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma. He is also a member of the Commission Planning America's 250th birthday celebration in 2026. Like Richard, Bill is an ISI alumnus. He was an ISI Weaver Fellow as a graduate student, and we're thrilled to have him here tonight.
Good to be here.
So before we begin, I would just like to remind those attending the webcast that at any time, they can submit questions on the right side of the screen in the Q&A tab. I will pull out the top questions a little later in the program to ask our panelists. But due to how the webcast system works, you won't actually see other people's questions, but I will be accumulating all of those questions, and they are indeed there during the presentation. So now to get us started, I would like to ask each of our panelists to lead us off with some thoughts on this pandemic and how it might be affecting our government, the economy, and our cultural and social institutions, including education. Heather, I turn to you first.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you for inviting me. And it's an honor, as always, to be associated in any way with ISI. I'm going to speak first just generally about my reactions to this extraordinary moment, and then specifically about higher education, to end on a possibly more positive note, since this may be the death knell for the decadence that we've been seeing accumulate for the last 3 decades in higher education. I actually think that we may be living through the biggest policy mistake in American history. We're operating with a principle that has never before governed policymaking in either the private or the public sector, which is zero risk tolerance. As Governor Cuomo in New York City has said, if we save only one life with all of our measures, it will have been worth it. With all due respect and with all respect for life, that is simply an unrealistic standard. The Americans tolerate 40,000 highway deaths a year knowingly because they prefer to value their own safe convenience in driving at relatively high speeds. We could cut that number in half or 3/4 by mandating a 25 mile per hour driving speed. We don't do that. We're shutting down the economy worldwide. This is an experiment that has never been undertaken before. I fear that the American standard of living is going to be destroyed for decades. Every day, I think we're like in a house being eaten away by termites that can collapse. The damage is being done silently, invisibly. It is impossible to calculate at this point the complex damage that is being done to supply chains, to people's ability to find work. We're taking these extraordinary measures with complete ignorance. Every scientific model that has been put forward to predict either hospital bed shortages, ventilator shortages, death counts have all been proven wildly overestimates by a factor of 10 or more sometimes. And yet now when a few governors are tentatively starting to reopen their economies, we're listening to the same public experts who are saying that this is going to unleash a new apocalyptic wave of death across America when they've been wrong with every previous prediction. Where did this ethic of zero tolerance for risk come from? I'm speculating as a tentative matter, possibly from college campuses with the safetyism ethic that we see there. I'm not going to go into that right now, but that's something I've been batting around in my mind. The fact of the matter is that the coronavirus is terribly dangerous to the elderly and infirm, and that's a tragedy. But it is concentrated demographically and geographically. It is concentrated among the elderly, those with pre-existing conditions, in nursing homes. In New York City, in New Jersey, 40% of all deaths have been in nursing homes. In New York State, about 20%. Nationally, about 20%. We should be focusing on isolating the people that are most at risk and allow the economy to move forward. This coronavirus sets virtually no risk to the young. There's been no deaths, unlike the seasonal flu, which takes over 100 young people every year. I'm not prone to conspiracy theories, but I think that it's hard to avoid noticing that the left in this country is licking its chops at the pretext for expanding government to astronomical levels. They are applauding the fact that pollution levels are down, that global warming, carbon emissions are down. This will undoubtedly provide a precedent for declaring a national emergency in the future with regards to climate change and shutting down the economy. Now, the left can somehow be somewhat be excused because they actually believe that government is not just an adequate substitute for private economic activity, but is preferable. So they undoubtedly think that these trillions of dollars that are pouring forth from the government will make the economy whole or provide precedent for it to be even better. That, of course, is ludicrous. There is no amount of government printed money that can possibly substitute for the beauty, complexity, precision of private sector supply chains and free voluntary exchange. Nothing possibly from the government can substitute for that. What is curious to me, and I'm just going to say this as an aside, is the divide that has opened up within the conservative movement between writers like myself who are skeptical of the measures that are being taken economically, the fact that the deaths that are going to occur through deaths of despair, suicide, drug abuse, poverty worldwide, social unrest worldwide are going to dwarf anything the coronavirus could do. And those other conservatives that attack the skeptics and are just as adamant that we need to shut down the economy. Let me now turn to higher education briefly. The silver lining would be if the bubble finally bursts, something that's been predicted by optimists for 3 decades, that tuitions can't go any higher. The insanity of the diversity bureaucracy cannot get any worse. The expansion of the bureaucracy, now about 1-to-1 bureaucrat to faculty member nationwide, cannot get any more shameless. The greed of colleges who have massive recruitment operations, both internal and contracted out, to try and get as many warm bodies into their college seats as possible, simply to get those tuition dollars or college loans in the bank, notwithstanding that about 40% of all college freshmen drop out because they are so woefully underprepared for college work. We are dumbing down what a college education means in order to accommodate these people who really should be having meaningful lives in vocational education. The colleges don't give a damn. They bring them in, they flounder, the students drop out, but they've got at least their first year of tuition in the bank. The hope is that the economic devastation that is going to happen, not just to parents, but will happen to colleges, will force a radical rethinking on students' parts. Now you have very few colleges that are returning tuition, having gone online, implicitly sending the message that it's just as good to be online. Why should we refund your tuition? Because you can, it's not as if we're providing a substandard product. The cuts are coming. So far, I've not noticed any cuts, however, to the diversity sinecures. You still have the dance of the diversity deans proceeding at a brisk pace. Harvard is recently bringing on somebody from NYU who've been their diversity dean to now serve as Harvard's diversity dean of inclusion. The person that the NYU dean, that post being vacated, is going to be filled by somebody else. These will probably be the last positions to be cut simply because they add so-called diversity to a college's matrix of bean counting. Nevertheless, it may be the case that we start to regard education not as something merely to put on your credentials, but as something that returns us to serious learning. Also, I would hope what discredits these schools is their unabated greed. You have Harvard, Yale, places with a million in endowment to 2 million endowment per student, who are taking up the college bailout money from the federal government, who are continuing to raise money from students for their own hardship funds. They have been exposed for the greedy grifters that they are, and we'll hope from now on that donors wise up and don't give them another damn cent. So I'll close it there. Thank you, Charlie.
Yeah. Thank you. Richard, we'll turn to you.
Charlie, thank you for inviting me. I love being a part of anything ISI is doing. I wanted to say, just building on something that Heather said, we have 2 representative sampling tests of testing, antibody testing, that have been done in California, one Santa Clara County and the other one in Los Angeles County. And both of those tests came back with the results that of the people they had tested, I think in Santa Clara it was 3,000 people, and in Los Angeles County it was 900 people, that the order of magnitude of infection was something like 28 to 56 times higher, multiple of what official statistics represent. Thus, the mortality rate you could draw from that is something like 0.1 or 0.2, meaning that the virus, even amidst social distancing, has spread to a much larger number of people. And the mortality rate is actually quite low. It's pretty much compatible with seasonal flu. And I think that is going to raise the question in a lot of people's minds of what exactly are we doing with this lockdown mentality? The question that I've had in my mind, I think a lot of us have had, is what type of a country are we going to become on the other side of this crisis? What will we look like? What will we emerge as? And, my thinking is sort of every time we've had a crisis in this country in the 21st century and in the 20th century, it has grown the government. It's grown the government at the expense of constitutional liberties, federalism. It's grown the executive bureaucracy at the expense of separation of powers. And it's changed our lives. And I don't think necessarily for the better. And my sense is going in, when we started this 6 weeks ago, I went into lockdown a month ago living in Indiana. I thought that would happen in this crisis as well. However, I think there are some silver linings, and I kind of put them in the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think the good is, and I think what a lot of conservatives recognize, is the official bodies, ranging from the transnational, the World Health Organization, where we have a lot of evidence that they're just in the pay of the Chinese government, and the Chinese government itself lying. And the federal government, not necessarily lying, but their models, as Heather indicated, don't necessarily seem to be panning out. They don't even know really what we're supposed to be doing to protect ourselves until recently. I remember the mask sort of fiasco. And the question becomes, who can you trust? And I think what a lot of us have figured out is you really can trust yourself, the information you're able to find, what you're learning from your neighbors, what you're watching people do. And that's sort of, so in a way, we're on our own here, and we're learning that governments, to the extent they can protect us, it's not so much the federal government, it's our local governments and state governments. And so you have seen something like federalism emerge to help us in sort of a practical, results-oriented sense. And you're seeing a divergence, I think, between the red states and the blue states as to who's ready to go back to work and bring this to an end. Indiana's going to open up next week. My home state of Tennessee opens up Friday. So that's clearly a difference, and that's a wonderful thing. Chris DeMuth had a great essay this weekend in the Wall Street Journal. I disagreed in part with it, but I think he's right on in that who's really leading here? Is it the federal government, or is it the federal government as facilitator? And what we're really seeing a lot of private sector corporations, particularly building on another government failure, which has been massive in this regard, the Centers for Disease Control, pushing university and private corporate labs out of the way because it was going to develop the corona test. And of course, it royally failed at this, pushing us back 6 weeks to having a test. So now we have a good test. It's from Abbott Laboratories. It gives you results in 15 minutes. But of course, the components and the infrastructure to get it out on a wide basis are lacking at this point. And then also the waiver of regulations has been a positive thing. Could that continue? Do we seize on that? Telemedicine, physicians practicing across state lines, nurse practitioners being able to do their thing without a supervising doctor, CDC, the FDA. I mean, the things, they have always stopped medical innovation. I mean, that's sort of the way they operate. And now it turned really deadly. And of course, part of the reason why we have this massive shortage, which is absurd, is because of the FDA. They've waived a lot of their regulations. So we need to build on that. The governor of New York, the amount of regulations he's waived, I saw a list. It took up a whole page, single spaced. Of course, New York is New York, so that's to be expected. But all of those things you could build on. But of course, there's also the bad. And the bad really goes under spending, deficits, and debt, and a CARES Act that, from what I could tell, only something like 20% of the $2.2 trillion actually went into healthcare. You had, the spending under that bill, $510 billion loans to large businesses. But of course, the amount, when I read the amount of total corporate debt and corporate bonds outstanding is actually lower than what is allotted to them under that bill, under the Federal Reserve being able to leverage it 10 to 1 to something like 4.5 trillion. So that really begs the question, could they actually eclipse private capital, and the Federal Reserve becomes the dispenser of corporate lending? So that, and of course we know, right? How does information work? That's not how information emerges best, is through that sort of central control. And then, the deficit in debt, the deficit by September is going to be 18.7% of the economy. The debt will be higher than the actual size of the economy by September. And of course, the Federal Reserve is now buying $30 billion worth of government bonds every day. In March, it was $75 billion. To put that into perspective, quantitative easing at its height in 2010 was something like $110 billion a month. Now they're doing that every 4 days. So that raises the question, we keep hearing this, the interest rates are low, don't worry about it. The Treasury Secretary said, now's the time to take on this debt. It's under 1%. We can fix it later. Well, it's under 1% because the Fed's manipulating the rate with all these purchases. And it can't be the case that you can just endlessly take on debt. I think that brings us also to the ugly. One is the bailout of a corrupt blue state spending model. You now see calls for, quote, unrestricted state aid. The senator from New York, Charles Schumer, called for that this week. And all of that is New York, Illinois, New Jersey, California cannot even begin to repay these public sector union debt obligations, healthcare obligations they have to them. They run annual deficits, a third of their budget. They depend on federal transfer payments. They're trying to make that more permanent, to give them a way around the problem that they're in. And that, of course, makes prudent states like the one I live in, which is very responsible, look like suckers because we end up bailing them out. That seems to me really bad, that this sort of really healthy fiscal competition that's been, I think, very strident since the Obama administration could somehow be upended by this. Also, further ugliness would just be, and I think Heather sort of alluded to this, but could this change the way we think? Could it change our mores with regard not only just to the size of government, but we actually move in the direction of this modern monetary theory thinking that guides sort of the Sanders campaign and sort of this new left, that somehow debt doesn't matter. We can really take it all on. We can take as much as we want on. We only owe it to ourselves. And that allows you to begin to plan for something like the Green New Deal. Not that that's really operable in a practical sense, but moving in that direction, moving into nationalizing healthcare, other industries. And so we become a different country. We absorb debt and don't really think about the cost. But of course, it's only true until it isn't. And when it isn't, that's when you're in a really bad situation debt-wise. So all of this leads me to think there's a very mixed record of how we end up. And I think it really will largely depend upon the type of arguments that get made politically about the type of country we want to become on the other side of this. But my worry is right now there's something like this lockdown socialism. You stay at home and you still have money in your bank account, courtesy of the federal government. You can't run your business, but somehow it keeps going because of all the small business loans. You sort of take it for granted. Truckers are still working, et cetera. People in the front lines are still working. But what are you doing? What are you contributing? Does that shape us into more of a, I don't know, it's more of an idle population, for lack of a better description. So those would be my thoughts.
Great. Well, Richard, thank you for that, those insights and comments. And so I will quickly segue over to you, Bill, for some remarks.
Yeah, I wanted to address, more directly the question about, what does conservatism have to say about the global pandemic? That is, does conservatism, does a recourse to conservative ideas, conservative principles give us a better way of thinking about how to respond to it? And there's several things that my colleagues here have already touched on that I think fit right into the conservative view, the conservative playbook, philosophically and historically. One thing I think of, Randolph Bourne had this famous saying, "War is the health of the state," and it's not encouraging when the president decides to couch, as innumerable presidents and administrations before his have, this struggle in terms of warfare. That's certainly as dead a metaphor as one could find, but it's a dangerous dead metaphor because the notion of war involves rendering legitimate the marshaling and drawing together of all the forces, social and economic forces, cultural forces, everything in a society directed towards some nationally prescribed end. And that is not conservatism, at least not as conventionally, traditionally understood. Conservatism is a deep suspicion of concentrated power. And this has been true. Nothing is more American than that contention, going back to the revolution and the lead up to the revolution. And nothing is more quintessentially conservative than that contention. So the concentrated power is dangerous. I won't quote Acton again. You all can just fill in the blank. But the rhetoric of war is a handmaiden of this kind of vision of a sort of fiercely and ruthlessly efficient military organization of society. And this is language that Franklin Roosevelt, actually Theodore Roosevelt too, very fond of, as a way of thinking of the concentration of force that's at the heart of the progressive idea. I think we should resist that kind of rhetoric, that way of thinking. The conservatism offers a much better way of thinking about how to arrange the forces of society in such a way that countervailing forces will help to counteract some of that tendency towards absolutism and tyranny and arbitrariness that we find in overly concentrated power. And this is where I'm glad Richard made mention of the Christian Muth article, which I also thought was terrific. Actually, I'd like to be interested to know, Richard, if we have a chance, what your complaints were about it, because I thought it was pretty great. But it was a long article. Anyway, for those who didn't see it, was in Saturday's Wall Street Journal. I highly recommend it. He was arguing that Trump has, unlike any other president or any other administration dealing with a national crisis of this sort, catastrophe, has sought to decentralize as much as possible the way of addressing it. So after saying he had total control and having the governors say, no, you don't, he said, well, he got thrown into the briar patch and gave them what they wanted, and which is politically speaking very smart, because it allows him to diffuse responsibility for what is going to be ugly, no matter what. There's going to be difficult trade-off kinds of decisions, which are the heart of political life, but which the kind of rhetoric that Heather talked about of, if even one life can be saved, that this is the opposite of sane political thinking. So I think we're seeing in a lot of ways the advantages of a federated or non-centralized form of government in this crisis, in the way that it's unfolding. Of course, we're right in the middle of it. We don't know where we're going. So I can take refuge in being a historian and not a prophet, but it does seem to me, in terms of conservative doctrine, conservative ideas, conservative vision, this is better than the alternative. So another thing that's been touched on is it is conservative, it seems to me, to be distrustful of experts. That not in a mindless way, not in a know-nothing sort of way, but understanding that expertise is limited. It's limited in a number of ways. You can be an expert about one thing, as Deborah Burks is, and not know much about the surrounding network of issues that particular area of expertise feeds into and has to be placed within, so that it can be a kind of blindness, a kind of deep insight into one narrow thing that is a blindness to all the things surrounding. So, and also experts can be wrong, even in their field of expertise. I think epidemiology, now in my book, is right up there with the economists for the inadequacy of their expert forecasts. And of course, epidemiologists, like economists, I guess, at least those who are politically connected, have a motive to exaggerate. When the choice between going up or down presents itself, they always go up, because there's no real danger in that. if they prove to be wrong, everyone will be believed. Life goes on. If they understate it, then their name is mud. So they follow very simple human motives when you boil it all down. But so experts can be genuinely expert, but narrow. Experts can be pseudo-experts. They can think that by putting on a white coat and making a pronouncement with a stethoscope in their hand, that they should be accorded authority. And that's not, if I may quote Obama, that's not who we are. At least not who we were. We should be able to say that the experts. Let me quote a wonderful saying, slightly risque, at least in some people's ears, but from James Q. Wilson. He said, experts should be on tap, but not on top. And I love that. I think that's exactly right. We should draw on expert knowledge, but a political leader, a statesman, is guided by a kind of prudential wisdom that enables him or her to say, in the larger scheme of things, you're right, but we can't do this, or we can't do it to the same extent you're talking about. And I think the medical group that Trump has surrounded himself with is probably, who knows, but probably being dragged, if not kicking and screaming, somewhat unwillingly into an opening up that if they have their druthers, certainly Dr. Fauci, as we all call him, would like to keep us cooped up for 18 months. And it's not his problem how we're going to live, how we're going to eat, how we're going to subsist, whether that is a life worth living. It's another thing that I think it's not only conservatives, but we have an understanding of human nature that there is a dignity of work, that in some way we need the discipline, the teleology of work to fully realize ourselves as human beings. And if we don't have that, if we're merely alive, confined to our little cabin or whatever place we find for ourselves, is that really the good life for man? Is it a good aspiration of a good society, merely to keep people alive at any cost, and to avoid all risk? I think I'm really anxious to hear what Heather has to say about this, because I think she's right. There's a kind of pathology about risk, and I certainly see it in higher education. I certainly see it in child rearing. It's a real problem for us, and in higher education, as we saw at Middlebury College when Charles Murray was attacked, the word resiliency, which I thought was a good thing. So it was one of the things that certainly in my children I wanted to inculcate. It's now a bad thing. It's something that you say the F-bomb in front of, and consign to the depths thereby. So expertise, I think, and by the way, higher education gains a lot of its prestige as being the accreditor of expertise and as being the most meritocratic organization in American society. And that's both true and untrue. And in some ways, our colleges and universities don't really produce people who are able to function in a practical and resilient way in today's world. But the ways of measuring merit have become so debased and really reduced to scores and standardized tests and that sort of thing. But I think I'll just mention one other thing. I think that, and this I may get into it a little bit with Richard on this, but I think that a global pandemic of this sort, particularly emanating from the country from which it emanated, on which we have so much dependency in terms of our trade, in terms of our manufacturing in terms of the production of essential goods really calls into question a lot of the policies that we've had towards that have led us into this position of global dependency, and it calls into question open borders, which ought not to have been much of a question to begin with, but it calls into question how we allowed ourselves to become a country with a hollowed out manufacturing base that can't produce the essentials for itself and is thus extremely vulnerable to all kinds of subversion and weakness. So I'll stop there. But I think there again, and that's a certain kind of conservatism. It's not a wild, free, open borders, libertarian understanding of conservatism. It's a more moderately nationalist understanding that while free trade is a very good thing and demonstrably good, it has to be balanced against national imperatives and national needs. And that, I think, is a very conservative insight.
Can I provide a portrait of New York City that answers some of the questions that have been raised here rhetorically, like what sort of country have we become and are we becoming? How did we allow ourselves to become a country with such a hollowed out manufacturing base? I go out to Central Park in Manhattan for exercise very, very early in the morning. It's before 6 p.m. It's still slightly dark. There's people out there. There's maybe 100 people spread out over 600 acres. The joggers and cyclists are wearing masks. And I don't think this is a good Samaritan issue, because if I proceed towards them from 25 yards away on a trajectory that will, at our closest, we will be maybe 10 yards away and going in opposite directions. So at each other's like shoulders for a millisecond, there will be the most extraordinary aversive behavior, lunging away. People have become, have adopted a degree of paranoia that is astounding. To me, this suggests we have got to take these shutdown orders down now, because the understanding of risk, people think that you can communicate this virus outdoors, which is absurd, certainly not in a windy environment. But the degree of risk aversion that is happening on a minute-by-minute basis, we could open things up. You know, there's the supply side argument for reopening, which is, my God, let these entrepreneurs get back to their lives if they can. Many of them are never going to be able to start up again. But the demand side issue is also very critical, because even if these businesses open up, people have been so scared out of their wits voluntarily that they're not going to go back to the normal way of life. And the experts that you've rightly have questioned their awareness of the sort of the tour d'horizon, what's beyond their specific little bailiwick, are saying, don't open up. It's going to bring on more problems, and people will not go back to this. What I've also noticed is the extraordinary class divide. How did we become a nation with a manufacturing base that's hollowed out? Because the elites, who are the ones that are sheltering in place, who work with abstractions, who are truly the transnational elites, they work from anywhere, they work with ideas, they work from their computers. It's not a big deal for them to be told to stay at home. For people that are in the service sector, in the retail sector, you have to be at a particular place to work. Now, some of those people are working. They've been declared essential, which is a preposterous argument for the government to make to its employees. Every business is essential. But let's put that aside. For the people that need to be in a particular place at a particular time in order to earn a wage, this is very hard on them. And
so let me just try to looking at what does this say about conservatism given the global pandemic, and one of the questions presented was, does this shelter in place, and does this elites are going to be protected, and the regular Joe out there is the guy that's got to be driving the truck to bring stuff to your door and work in the grocery stores and work in the manufacturing facilities. Does it talk to our society's destruction of the traditional groundings and foundations such as moral order and place and family and local community, and have we as conservatives failed to deliver that message in a cogent fashion and help society be prepared for something like this?
Well, I mean, just to think about that great age before this happened, before we went all in lockdown, we had essentially like the lowest unemployment rate you can have, according to college, 3.5%, and of course now it's at something like 13%. It seems in some ways it seems difficult to argue that we weren't talking about community. I think we were. One of the things that might come out of this crisis actually is community, and is the realization. Bill alluded to open borders. I don't think anyone's ever really in favor of open borders other than, say, EU bureaucrats. But if you look at what's really protecting people and what are you actually relying on right now, well, for a lot of people, it's true, it's federal aid. But of course, the federal government and the state governments threw them out of their job in a way that seems logical to me, that they would get some sort of help. But it's your family. It's your family. Yeah. It's your home. I think about just running around my neighborhood. I've looked at it differently in the past few weeks. I've seen things I haven't seen before. Could you extend that more broadly and say we're learning things about our communities that we've just sort of taken for granted? I hope we are through all this situation. And also what's protecting us, it's our nation states. The nation, turns out it matters. So that, in this sort of, and Bill alluded to trade and supply chains. Obviously, there's a national security exception to trade. We might need to rethink how much we're doing in China. I think that will happen slowly, but I don't think it'll be so much an end to free trade and a repatriation of manufacturing jobs back to America. They'll become enormously expensive if they are, but it'll be moving around other nations beside China with whom we do a lot of this trade. I think that will begin to happen. So that's, and is there a national security exception? Do we need to be manufacturing certain medicines here, or at least stockpiling things? I think that's something we've learned that we didn't know that we need to do, but we have to set up the incentives to do it. It can't just be intentions. It'll have to be certain incentives to companies and to hospitals and healthcare corporations to do these things. So that's a policy response as well.
This issue of community, Heather's description of Central Park is just really startling and poignant and all these things. But it's an illustration. There's a way in which these commands to us from government and from experts about the way in which we should respond to other people who are right next to us are they're a real barrier. That the other day I'm here at Pepperdine this year, and I happened to be present when Gordon Lloyd, who was a venerable professor here, Gordon, Richard, I know. Yeah. And he'd come back, and Cheryl, the sort of administrative dean, saw Gordon and just came up and gave him a giant hug. And I felt so exhilarated by that she just didn't give a damn. She had to give Gordon a hug. She hadn't seen him in a long time. And there's a surface tension that I think is there in our relations with this wearing of masks and all of that, that we have to overcome in order to be able to take hold of that community that you're describing. There's a certain way in which the commands from Big Brother kind of get in the way of our relating to one another openly and generously in community. You see what I'm saying? You look dubious.
I don't know if you guys can see this. I'm going to hold this up, probably not. The New York Times had a big graphic page, social distancing, why 6 feet? And they've got the pictures of two individuals, and one coughs, and it emits just this Holocaust-level cloud of dangerous pathogens, and it's got little circles of how far these droplets go. And the experts quoted in this massive front full page graphic, learn from the graphic, said, but don't think even 6 feet is safe, because a droplet has been known in certain conditions to travel 25 feet. Well, the fact is that dosage matters. There may be one droplet. You're not going to get it from one droplet. So they are not just telling us 6 feet, you got a distance. They're wanting to up the ante at every moment. It is
Panic is good for you. Look at the head of the CDC today said, we got to be prepared. There may be a second wave.
Yeah.
And he has no business. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And I can say that. I'm a citizen. I can say that. He can't possibly know what he's talking about. He's just scaring the hell out of people.
I think wrong about the first wave, and now we're supposed to believe them about the second wave.
It is a fact, right? That in theory and reality are the same things, and in reality they're not. And so these guys are indeed dealing with theory, but they have an advantage in their marketing that conservatives don't, and that is I can roll a camera up to outside the nursing home or to the vehicles, the big frozen trucks where they've got the bodies, and everybody sees that and gets highly afraid because they think they're going to be in there, because they don't hear some of the statistics that 40% of them are we're in nursing homes, and again, maybe that might be my mom still. So how do you address that piece of it, that there is an inherent fear that people have of a blind, unknown pathogen, if you will?
I think one thing that has to be kept in mind too, Bill alluded to, I think, sort of the politics of war in his opening comments. I mean, how have we done politics in this country around great questions now, stretching back, I don't know, to the Civil Rights Act, potentially. And that is, we tend to have this posture of a black and white issue, and it's hard to have any sort of real debate or form a consensus through disagreement and compromise. It tends to be one way or the other. I mean, just think about the highlights of the last 50 or 60 years in American politics: war on drugs, no child left behind, the war on terror, the war on poverty. You could produce a lot of different initiatives. And I think it all ultimately stems, though, from this root notion that there is an expert, that there is a science of administration that we can actually tap and uncover and relieve us of the burden of something else Bill talked about, of prudential judgment. But of course, that's not true. But it leads to a certain kind of politics of outing the person who disagrees with you, because it's not just a disagreement, it's they're on the wrong side of the science, or, on moral issues, they're on the wrong side of history. And of course, we're going to bring that forward to this crisis. And we see it. And so, Trump says these blundering things, but I sort of agree with Trump on a lot of these things. And I think he's, in his own way, take him seriously, not literally. I think he's trying to channel the small business owner. I think he's trying to channel certain workers and administrations to open up the economy. But of course, he needs to display tactfully a prudential disagreement and better judgment than what he's hearing from Fauci or certain politicians, primarily on the left, who disagree with him. He needs to show why it is the case that the experts disagree, and the experts' models don't give us anything we can rely on. We're going to have to learn to balance an array of factors, and we need leadership in that regard, but we don't have it.
I will give him credit, though. I mean, you could say that it was a matter of political necessity that he surrounded himself with white coats and stethoscopes at some point in this process, just political reality. But from very early on, he said, let's not make the cure worse than the disease. And that's a good principle. I mean, and I think we are at the point, as all three of us agree, of making the cure much worse than the disease, even though we don't entirely understand the disease. That governing is a question of trade-offs. It always is. And I think the things that Cuomo said early on, he's kind of changed his tune somewhat, I think, but very unhelpful in that. But one of the things I I think that the message about the demography of the victims has to get out. There has to be more attention paid to that, even if it comes at the expense of people like me. I'm in the high risk group, by the way, in case you were wondering. And so my kids love to lord it over me. Well, but you're high risk. But we need to, even if it comes at the political expense of labeling folks and treating them differently. That's much better than Heather, I think, alluded to this at the beginning. It's much better than having a one-size-fits-all imprisonment for the entire population. You isolate as much as you can the areas that are afflicted, and you work within that. And by the way, that's again another example of the advantages of a sort of federative principle of government that. This may be a strange analogy, but naval ships are designed with watertight compartments that if they're hit, they're damaged in one area, they can seal off that compartment and still keep the ship afloat, even despite it being destroyed and what would have sunk it under other circumstances. There's an analogy there, I think, to what the federal system. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, they're taking a hit. I don't mean my daughter lives in New York, so I'm not being not just you, Heather. I'm not being casual about New York, but
we deserve it.
That doesn't mean that Omaha or Santa Fe or even Southern California ought to be subject to the same kinds of constraints.
Well, Charlie asked, how do you dial back the fear? And that's a really tough question. One would hope that over time we would return to a normal way of being in the world. On the other hand, let's note that it seems like in some cases there's a ratchet upwards that never comes down. We're still, unless you have TSA pre-check, we're still taking off our shoes at security checkpoints because there was one guy purported to be a shoe bomber. We don't even know if it would have worked. That was 20 years ago? We're still taking off our shoes and people are accepting this docilely. So again, I subject myself to the New York Times. I hope I'm taking a hit for you guys and you don't as well, because you are, and I admire you.
I'm trying to stay optimistic with the Wall Street Journal editorial page.
Right, we need to parse out our mental capacities and emotional tranquility. But I cannot tell you the daily pounding they are giving of we cannot give up the social distancing. The articles about from now on, everything of our life is going to change. There was an op-ed yesterday in the New York Times by a former head of the CDC or FDA, David Kessler, from the 90s.
Oh, yeah, that guy.
He basically said, from here on, we should eliminate our social contacts by 75% for an indefinite period of time. We should only see 25% of the people we were seeing before. Our offices should be depleted. No more public transit, no more group activities. It is extraordinary. And I don't know how quickly we will go back to being normal human beings and not seeing a bugaboo in our shadow every time we turn around. It's a real question. And yes, I've written about this all the time. I've seen some of these comments putting the all causes deaths every year, 2.8 million, deaths a year, hundreds of thousands a day that dwarf anything we're seeing now, even under the worst IMHE predictions practically. And talking about the demographics that were clear in Italy and they've been completely replicated here. But it's very hard to get that message out there.
I think you have to assume, I begin from the premise of a relational human nature, that we're not just beings of contract and consent. We're actually deeply relational, formed by our bonds, our obligations, and our duties to other people. And largely, I mean, when I heard Heather's that comment about 75, we should reduce our contacts by 75%. The immediate thought that came to mind is man in the state. That somehow that's always been the progressive idea that our lives would largely be managed by the state. And think about the Life of Julia political cartoon, where they really made that explicit as a part of a campaign. It was really creepy. But my sense is we're not going, I mean, whatever fears that we have, people ultimately are going to come out. We're going to want to bond with others, and we're not going to want to let that go. And I think you see that even, I mean, I think that the absurdity of, not absurdity, but it's strange, of churches wanting to have services where everyone's in their car in the parking lot, and the preacher sort of stands in front of them and conducts the service. But I think that's a relational human nature. That's a return, trying to find and worship God through this crisis. Anecdotally, I'm on my parish council, and there was sort of a livid, palpable anger. We had an online Zoom meeting this week against our bishop for closing down the entire diocese. And I thought that was great, disagreeing with the bishop. And so I really desired to return and not lose all of the things that we have there. So my sense is, whatever, we're stuck with human nature, or as Peter Law would say, we're stuck with virtue. We're stuck with who we are. And that, I think that will come through. Now, the question, though, is, do bad habits get formed through a lot of this largesse and through a lot of the government largesse? And I think that's unavoidable. I mean, I'm thinking about after the financial crisis, what many noted is that it further accelerated the pre-existing trend of prime age working men falling out of the labor force. One of the reasons why they could do that is they could patch together a living through the disability payments program, healthcare through Medicaid that seems to have accelerated the opioid abuse, the extension of Medicaid under Obamacare. So, I mean, those sorts of things, I think, could worsen under this crisis, or in various ways. But I think socially, we will not want to stay in there.
You know, I just have an article coming out in City Journal any day now on what I'm calling the college woke spa that I began long before this insanity, this moral panic took over. Based on, at Yale in particular, they have this therapeutic culture center that is the epitome of the feminized university. It's, it's got a sandbox and essential oils and massage therapy and yoga. And I'm sure we'll have seen this, this feminized, you talk about resiliency, the mindfulness, the yoga, the stuff that's going on. But again, it's not a perfect thesis because the insanity and the moral panic is happening globally. But a lot of what I was seeing already on campuses with this mental health crisis and students having crises and needing all their therapy, and the colleges being only too happy to expand their bureaucracy to take on now this massive mental health agenda that extends to parents, that extends to the healthy. There is now the very strong strain in our culture of the therapeutic state, the victimology that is at its most poisonous when it comes to race and gender oppression narratives, nevertheless applies even more broadly, I think. And so it's a curious thing to think about, that part of this may be, just as we've seen the diversity ideology migrate very quickly into government, into the private sector, into the corporate HR rooms, that possibly now the therapeutic mindset that I've documented in colleges laid somewhat of the groundwork for what we're seeing now.
Yeah. And I think, just to tie it into a sort of conservative theme, is it raises the question, do we now subscribe to the idea that health is the ultimate good, that health, the health
right.
trumps every other worthy human attribute? And I think conservatives, and not only conservatives, but certainly conservatives, will say no, of course not. And just on a less exalted level, as a teacher, as a professor, I find it's much harder to push students to, this is okay, but it's not really good enough. Go back to the drawing board, revise this, whatever, you never know what kind of collapse you're going to get from them, and then be visited by an associate dean or somebody, you have a problem with female students, or, I'm fortunate these things have not happened to me very much, but who knows how much I hold back in terms of being the kind of hard-ass professor who could really make somebody who was a kind of brilliant or promising even student into somebody who could really deliver the goods. And I think particularly minority students, none of us push them. None of us push them. And but that's a whole different, that's not just the therapeutic, that's some other things. But the therapeutic there is a easy resort to, well, I have a cognitive problem, I have to be tested in this way, you can't give me this kind of test, I don't do essays. What the hell are you doing here then? You can't say that, but this is all part of what you're describing. This is the triumph of the therapeutic.
And of course, now you have the big revolt against being graded this semester, and all the students demanding universal A's for everybody. So it's just carried on through. Yeah.
So it does create an inflection point, I think, right? Because the most popular grade being issued, about 50% of them nationwide now, is an A anyway. So this just gives the opportunity to just make everybody an A, right? We're all from Lake Wobegon. We're all now above average and that kind of thing.
We got into Harvard. That's the main difficulty.
So let's look at see, we segue to how do we reframe this to promote some of the things we talked about. One of the comments there was, can we use this as a great awakening? Another awakening. So, for instance, you can make the argument that the reason that we're in this situation is because of somewhat of a government failure. You can argue that a bunch of the left-wing policy pronouncements and ideas over the last 20 years or more, open borders, global institutions are better than the national institutions. We should not be using plastic bags because reusable bags are much better. And now Starbucks won't let you even bring your own coffee mug in to get coffee there because, it may be a dirty mug. Some of these kinds of ideas, that liberal policies are better to run our cities. And so what do? They send everybody home except for essential workers, and then they cut back railway service. So now all those essential workers are, shoved into small containers with each other for extended periods, right? So there's a huge failure of liberal policies. And how do we segue off of, well, I feel more like a Democrat today because I sleep in late, I sit around and drink coffee, I'm not very busy, and I'm waiting for a government check. How do I convert that to, here's why, conservatism related to a global pandemic, these were better ideas, and we should have been going this way from 20 years ago?
I think the basic question is that people can only do this for so long, I think, and in the absence of asking themselves the question, am I flourishing? And to put content into what does it mean to flourish as a human person? And that can't be, as I'm watching my 15-year-old son sleep in every morning, get up and do 3 or 4 hours of work, and then text with his friends or do whatever he does in the afternoons. That can't be ultimately sustainable. And people actually feel good about themselves, I think, in the overall population. And so there has to be a conversation just at a gut level of, what does it mean to flourish? What does it mean to to pursue happiness in a substantive way? And that has to be articulated. So in that regard, higher education being challenged on the merits or just being challenged on its balance sheet, I think is a good thing. And because they seem to be the ones who have started this, sort of a lot of ideas that have not stayed on campus. It seems to me I was on campus in the late 90s, early 2000s in law school. And I never thought the ideas I was hearing there would reach out and sort of find broader acceptance. So challenging that, watching them be challenged is a very good thing. And parents seeing what the actual product, this online product that I think students anecdotally don't seem to be accepting. But But at the very least, there's some challenge being issued to higher ed to show that their product is worth it. That's a good thing. Another level, it seems to me, something I touched on earlier, but it seems true, is to underscore who's really pulled us through here. And I don't think it's been the government. And you mentioned the ideas, the failure of certain ideas. But what's really pulled us through are people rolling up their sleeves who still can and going to work every day. And of course, corporations, the ones who can and have the opportunity, innovating and bringing us the products that we need to get through this.
Truckers, delivery guys.
That's all that.
Yeah. God bless them. Yeah. Richard, I just addendum to your point about this can't go on. There's all sorts of reasons why it can't go on. I mean, one is that the colleges they are going to have to open in the fall. That whatever they may be saying and dithering about, in the end, they have to open. Students, what I know from OU is that students are saying, if you're going to be all online in the fall, I'm not coming back. I'll come back when especially if they don't have football. I mean, that would be the end of the world. But so there's that. I mean, it's going to happen. I think they're going to find a way, and even the New York Times will find a way to excuse it for them to open. But the other thing is that we're not talking about the Black Death here. We're not talking about a scourge that no one understands, whose etiology is completely unknown, and we have drugs that seem to have some success in combating it, not curing it, but perhaps making it survivable even for older people. As we learn more, I think we're going to have more ways of antiviral, forms of combating the drug. And then there's the fact, you mentioned the Santa Clara study, and there's another one from LA today with the homeless. It's interesting when this whole thing broke, several of the people here at Pepperdine were saying, "Oh, wait until you see what happens with the homeless population. This is going to devastate. They're going to be stacking the bodies like wood cord, and it has not happened. Yeah. There's apparently herd immunity in those areas. Something is protecting them. The percentages, I've heard everything from 50 to 80 times the rate of exposure, but without being symptomatic in these studies. So this thing may pass through us in a way that is that was sort of heedless of all the measures that we've been taking, and people will catch on to that. They will start to be less cautious, little by little, and I do think it's unsustainable. I think, and there is also, and I'm very thankful for it, there's that good old American orneriness that we're seeing in some of these demonstrations. We are, if we're going to be a free people, we have to be an ornery people at times, and not take directions from the experts. I think for some of us, I've seen Peter Hitchens talk about this. It's been one of the most disturbing things is to see people cattle-like. So say, "Oh, okay, yes, sir," and the people in Central Park. That's such a haunting image. I'm going to have that in my mind for a long time. But it's a haunting image of the way that people's minds can be sort of dragon-ridden by something that somebody who claimed to be an expert told them. But again, I'm not meaning to say that COVID is not a nasty bug, but a nasty virus. But it's not the Black Death.
No, but it seems like we went into this lockdown too on the basis of these horror stories coming out of northern Italy, and this realization that China had been lying to us, and the Seattle nursing home situation, and it seems to me we all sort of panicked. I mean, I remember thinking, "Wow, this is really contagious and communicable," and oh my gosh, maybe we, I the first couple of days I thought maybe we really needed to do this, and my sense is I am, certainly my neighbors that I'm talking to it seems that we're learning that maybe this isn't needed. There is this sort of learning process that the Northern Italian situation was actually unique to their situations. It's the oldest country in Europe.
Well, and there's
their public capacity is overwhelmed almost every year regardless. So, of course, this completely destroyed them.
I was going to mention that the goalpost moving phenomenon too, which is that when we started talking about this, it was sort of we were flattening the curve so that the hospitals wouldn't be overwhelmed. I have a friend who's a doctor at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. He's going to New York because they've got so many empty beds. The Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. There's nothing for him to do. I mean, this has been we've largely succeeded in flattening the curve, and it's good that he's going to Brooklyn and going to one of these hospitals that is kind of overwhelmed. But it does seem that the generalization of this problem has been inaccurate, and we've moved the goalposts. Now we're going towards what Heather described as this sort of risk-free situation, and that's not realistic. I'm not sure if people would have agreed to that rationale at the outset.
I'm interested in Professor McClay's prediction that colleges will open in the fall, and let's just set up for ourselves a very fun activity, which is to watch the agonies that they will go through in making that decision, because you have on the one hand this massive bureaucracy that is invested in fear, in safetyism, that sees this as an enormous growth opportunity. On the other hand, you have the ruthless greed of these schools that want to bring in as many warm bodies as possible.
Yes.
And how they resolve that, I don't know, because if we are punctilious about social distancing, which I don't think we should be, I think it's growth. Again, like, you do not need to social distance when you're in the great outdoors. It is absurd. You cannot get infected that way, and yet everybody's taking it to that extreme.
Yeah.
And so, but if we're punctilious about the 6-foot rule, a lot of college activities cannot operate under that. So if colleges do in fact reopen, as Professor McClay says, it will mean that the society at large and the safetyism bureaucracy, the college woke spa bureaucracy, has lost its power. And I'm not, as a pessimist by nature, I'm not sure that we will have come out the good side of that. And on a personal note, let me just add a little footnote to my Central Park observations and personal experience. You can't see it now, but I was grotesquely swollen and bruised because I was on a bike in Central Park for the second time in 25 years because I can't swim. And this jogger in front of me thought she saw somebody way out into the other side that was approaching her. Without looking back, she darted right in front of me because she was so terrified. In the middle of Central Park, knocked me down. I got very injured. So that's what it's like out here. Now, you guys may be in different parts of the country, and maybe Peppermint is a little more sane. But they've closed off the Santa Monica Mountains to hikers there. Which
they did. Yes.
Really bad.
By the way, I say what I say simply because I think economically they have to find a way to open. They
can't. The colleges got there was $20 billion in the CARES Act for student loans. It's not inconceivable that another bailout for higher education could happen, which would allow them to not open. Under the safetyism rhetoric, blah, 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 we need to save higher education. It's the future. You can see how that would happen.
So just a real quick question. A friend of ISI and a neighbor, a longtime friend of mine, asked, what would Milton Friedman think about all this? What would he say? And I know none of you are economists or what have you, but I don't know if there's a.
Well, I think his answer would be let people be free to choose what they want to do. They're going to follow what they think are the proper safety protocols, and let them live their lives and continue to create economic and social value for themselves and others. And this is a tremendous waste, and it's a very dumb solution to a problem. So I think he would be pretty straightforward in that regard.
Yeah, let the consumer decide, and again, I'm worried that the consumer is so freaked out at this point that he will not go back to normal activity, but let the consumer decide what essential businesses are and whether there's enough protection in a business. It's not for the government to be making those judgments absent a crisis that we're not even close to at this point.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that. That's what he would say. I do think questions of public health are harder to resolve in strictly kind of liberal, individualistic terms. That questions of vaccination and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think that's what he would say.
I think too would be is the left and the class of our sort of moral arbiters able to turn social distancing into something like political correctness itself, that it becomes a moral standard of the people they can actually put on par with racists or bigots or homophobes, those who actually want to open or want to go to work and do normal stuff again. It seems to me that being set up as we speak.
True. There's an anchor at MSNBC, Alex Witt, who kept prodding her interlocutors several days ago when these protests were first beginning. Well, are these just political? There she was, employed by MSNBC. It was unthinkable to her that this could be something that is actually driven by pressing economic need. I would say, with the social distancing, and I think that's a very apt prediction that this is now going to become the new test of moral virtue. What's the campus rape bureaucracy going to do? Where are they going to come up with their Title IX kangaroo courts? And so what's going to happen is that rape is now going to migrate to the web. So if you're online, you're going to be there'll be a whole lot of online harassment claims that'll be generated to keep this whole thing going.
It's a fascinating point. So what do you think about the secular state declaring churches as non-essential?
Oh,
yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've had quite an interesting, email discussion with my bishop on this question, and he very strongly asserted that he was right to close down the diocese and the schools, and he did it before the state told him to, and he would continue to do so. But my question to him was, why could I go to Home Depot, which I did this weekend, to outfit my yard and my lawn for the spring, but not go to church? And why could I buy bottles of alcohol, which I did this weekend because, I'm at home. What else am I going to do? My exercise level is up, but unfortunately so is my drinking. But not go to church on Easter Sunday. And he really had no response. And
can I ask you,
the question becomes, why couldn't we social distance and still go to church? And that opportunity also has been foreclosed to us.
Richard, did he say that he would have, if he had been ordered by the state to close the churches, would he have complied? He did it of his own volition. But.
Well, I think for some reason he wanted to virtue signal to me that he wasn't being owned by the state, but he was doing this because it was the right thing to do. But of course, the question that's being raised is what's going to be left of a lot of churches who their donations are down dramatically. And I think also for Catholic schools, which are always barely operating, will they continue? And that's the reality. Yeah.
No, I think it answered your question, Charlie. I mean, I think that the New Jersey governor had the ultimate statement when it was Tucker Carlson, I think, asked him, don't you think that this is violating the Bill of Rights, the freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and so on? And he said, the Bill of Rights. I never thought about that. The Bill of Rights, that's above my pay grade. Well,
yeah.
These are the kind of people who are ruling us.
Dennis Prager wrote that if half the country's deaths were in Montana, would we shut down New York?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my federalism argument. Yes, exactly. Yeah. But
And also concentrated even within a few boroughs in New York City.
Yeah.
From what I've read. So
because the media is so located in New York or in DC or in LA and San Francisco and dominated by those urban and liberal environments, is that's what's driving the national policy?
Well, I think something you said earlier, Charlie, is the knowledge class themselves are not primarily affected by this in such a distinct way or disadvantageous way as other workers are. And so it seems to me they're more inclined to support this going forward. I think that's been rather obvious here. It's interesting, too, the Democratic Party, the way they seem to be behind a more strenuous lockdown standard. But what does that say about their location of support in the working class? It seems to me they know where their support is now clearly, and they've indicated that through the politics of this situation. It's a market opportunity for the Republicans here. We'll see if they capitalize on it.
Well, that's been obvious too for a long time with their position on illegal immigration or immigration generally. They would rather bring in people of color, contradicting their view that America is profoundly lethal to people of color. We'll put that contradiction aside, but they'd rather bring in this to change the demographics of the country and the low-income Black and Hispanic workers be damned. So they're definitely put identity issues ahead of good old-fashioned sort of Marxist class solidarity, which in my view would be a great improvement over the narcissism of contemporary identity politics.
Well, that brings up a question I wanted to ask. Is that with something we haven't mentioned, we've raised against it, and that is we're in a presidential election here, and how might all of this be unfolding differently if we were not? How might it change after November, depending, of course, on the outcome?
Yeah.
How much of policy is being driven by the sort of competition for political advantage with respect specifically to the presidential campaign? I know, Charlie, you're supposed to ask the questions, but
no, I'm happy to share.
I think we're always in campaign mode. I don't think, even if it wasn't the campaign, I think the Democrats would be engaged in the most amazing contradictions, the media as well, ignoring the fact that, as you say, Cuomo in his better days was downplaying the risk and saying the fear is worse than the disease. And Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York was. I'm not going to criticize them for downplaying it, but now that's all out of sight, out of mind. And anything that Trump said early on to downplay it, again, rightly so in my view, is being held against him, that he's responsible. He's killing people. So, certainly the fact that we're getting closer to the time when the Democrats can taste victory. I mean, it's more like living through the most amazing Greek tragedy here. It involves Aristotelian peripeteia, with a massive reversal of fortune, hubris being brought down. There's Trump pegging his success on the stock market and the economy, rightly. And that's the one thing that brings him down after Russia collusion and Ukrainian impeachment failed, and now who would have seen this coming? It's a lesson in fortuna that we cannot predict our world, that we are still vulnerable to things that come out of nowhere and change everything overnight. I mean, as a historian, one has to be stunned by the radical change in our world that was not foreseen. But again, from the Democrats, this is a fantastic thing. And from Trump's perspective, it is an amazing saga as well.
But it seems to me also, just political analysis, the person that the Democrats have nominated, Joe Biden, does not seem the one capable of seizing fortuna or making fortuna his own. He seems incapable of doing that. And largely, what is he offering? He's offering, I think his best play is to bring back Obamaism or some sort of optimism around Obama policies. But I don't know how that's going to. The best candidate for the Democrats was actually Sanders, given what's happened. He was this candidate of new ideas, completely new programs, nationalization left and right. And that's maybe what we're actually open to now. Biden seems incapable of doing that. Also, something that Heather said, the thing that's come out of nowhere and humbled us, does it also humble us to think that we can, use science or rational administration in government to somehow bring solutions? Could the very basis of progressive government, through some sort of reflection process, be undermined? That would be a good thing, but who knows?
Well, the problem is, of course, they win either way. If this goes away, they will be able to say it's because of our progressive big government mandates. And it's not falsifiable. Now, that's why there's so much hatred and anger being directed at Georgia and Tennessee and Sweden, or Japan, that are trying to do things differently, because heaven forbid we have a federalist experiment, the laboratory of democracy, to see what works best. But generally, that's the scary thing, is if things get better, they win, and if things get worse, they win, and it shows that we let up too quickly, and that's going to be a hard thing to overcome.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Or do people come out from the house and their hovel and say, "Wow, what a waste! What a waste! We were told by our betters to do this, and look where we are now."
Or there may be another event. Something may happen that will completely change the calculus and take our minds off of all this. But I have just one comment about the election, that the problem, yes, I'd see all the Greek tragic elements in that, but ultimately, the only way that Trump can lose is that people have to be willing to vote for his opponent. And he'll get a certain percentage, but my God, what a pathetic excuse for a presidential candidate coming out of a major political party he is. It's people have to be persuaded somehow that, but of course, it's that they're not voting for Biden. He's a stand-in for all the good guys that will be packing the Department of Justice and so on.
There's always a 25th Amendment, right? We really are sort of coming to the end of the time, and so I would like to take a moment just to thank Heather, Richard, and Bill for the spirited discussion and the ideas and thoughts that they brought to this, and their experience and knowledge. I think we learned a lot about the lasting impact of this pandemic and what the impacts could be as we go forward, and perhaps viewed through the lens of conservatism. So we look forward to seeing your continued work on this topic and others in the weeks and months ahead. May you live in interesting times, and indeed we do. And with folks like you out there helping us try to put some sense
saying,
to it.
Unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, really. Thanks, China. But I would also like to thank our supporters who joined us this evening. In many ways, you were witness tonight to a slice of what the ISI educational experience is for our students. It is never lost on me that since our founding in 1953, that ISI has been sustained entirely through private donations, with most of them coming from individuals like you who are on the line today. And I can't thank you enough. And I know our students and our faculty and others appreciate your support. And I know that if the traditions and values that undergird America's principles of liberty are to survive, not only in this pandemic, but the next one and into perpetuity, it will be in no small part because of your generosity, friendship, and support of ISI. So I would want to thank everyone for being here tonight. Again, thank you, Heather, Richard, and Bill. And everybody have a great night. And we will hope to see you soon in live person, and maybe even closer than 6 feet.
All right.
Yeah, you bet.
Thanks.
Have a group hug.
High five.
Thank you.